November 29th, 2005, Morgantown, West Virginia. It's a peaceful fall morning in the Mountain State when Chanel is getting off an almost 13-hour shift because it had gotten busy towards the end of his shift. Sean goes home to shower and change before going to the Star City Fire Department to sleep and be available for any emergencies that would come out. As well as being a respiratory therapist, Sean was also a volunteer firefighter. The time is around 8 a.m. When Sean arrives home, he recognizes a familiar smell of a house fire. House fires have a distinct smell to them as they are easily distinguishable from a chimney fire or even a brush pile burning. Worried that it's his own house, he investigates walking around the outside of his own home and then heads back to his driveway and takes a look around. Still not seeing any smokes or flames, he goes inside to take a shower and returns outside about 20 minutes later at about 8:20 a.m. At this time, the smell is a little bit stronger, but he still doesn't see anything. While walking to his car, he sees his neighbor Michelle Shelley Michael driving by in her SUV. Sean waves, but Shelley doesn't acknowledge Sean at all and keeps on driving. Shelley was working her shift as a nurse practitioner in the pediatric ICU of Ruby Memorial Hospital. When she was making her rounds that morning, she receives a phone call around 10:30 a.m. about her house being on fire. When she arrives home, she finds her house is engulfed in flames. Worried about her husband, Shelley makes several phone calls to her husband, but all calls go to voicemail. Unknowing where her husband is and unable to reach him, she worries that he might have not been able to get out of the house before it caught on fire. After firefighters extinguish the fire, they find a body in the bedroom still laying in bed. Without confirmation, it is presumed to be that of Jimmy Michael. Welcome to the campfire. Grab your s'mores and grab a seat. Thanks for joining me tonight around the campfire where we discuss the dark world of true crime. I am your host, Kevin. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast. And this is the case of Jimmy Michael. Before we get into the case tonight, I want to thank the show's sponsor, BetterHelp, for helping keep the flame lit of the campfire for this episode. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service that's 100% online. So you don't have that awkwardness of sitting in a waiting room with a whole bunch of other strangers waiting to see your therapist. With BetterHelp, you have access to a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with whatever you're dealing with. All you have to do to get started is answer some questions about what your needs and preferences are in therapy. So that way, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist that is right for you. And if you want to change your therapist because maybe you're not comfortable with them, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional charge. You also don't have to wait any specific time or any number of sessions to change your therapist. So when you match up with that right therapist, you can talk to your therapist however is most comfortable for you, whether it's text, chat, phone, or video. You can also message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you and your schedule. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you, with more scheduling flexibility and more affordable prices. So if you go to the website and use the show's code, betterhelp.com/CCC, not only does that let them know that you heard it at the campfire, but you'll also receive 10% off your first month. So that's betterhelp.com/CCC. BetterHelp, HELP.com/CCC. Alright guys, before we start getting into the backgrounds, I just want to thank everybody out there joining me around the campfire. The campfire is reaching worldwide, so we are reaching the UK, Norway, Australia, Switzerland, and parts of India. So thank you everybody. Alright, so now diving into the case, James Michael, also went by Jimmy, was born February 20th, 1972 in Cumberland, Maryland. Jimmy was the second son of Denny and Ruth Michael. Jimmy's family came from a family of pastors, as they were very religious. Jimmy's father grew up on a farm, and him and Jimmy's mother, Ruth, were high school sweethearts where they would get married. Had Jimmy's older brother first, Steve, and then Jimmy came along a little bit later. Before Jimmy's father became a pastor, he would sell and buy real estate and land, never losing any money though whenever the market would decline. Steve was tall and athletic, but not academically inclined, where Jimmy was short and stocky and very intelligent. Jimmy was one of those people that was goal-oriented and disciplined, so whenever he set himself a goal, he would achieve it. Jimmy would go hunting and fishing with his father Denny. He would become pretty good at it too. Hunting was never one of those things that I never got into, but was always curious about trying. So in junior high, Jimmy meets Carrie Whitaker, who would become a lifelong best friend of Jimmy's. Their bond would become stronger and lasting through adulthood, where Carrie would describe their friendship as a brother-sister type of relationship. So growing up, Jimmy was always accident prone. He would get into different types of accidents. In high school, Jimmy fell in love with a girl who we are going to call Pamela Ross, because according to the source, Pamela wasn't her real name, just the name that was referenced. Pamela's mother wouldn't approve of the relationship because she didn't want Pamela to have a steady relationship in high school. So after 2 years of dating, Pamela breaks up with Jimmy because of Pamela's mother. Jimmy would take it pretty hard and would take a while to get over it. Eventually, Jimmy's father would come home one day and brought him into the bedroom and told Jimmy that he would have plenty of women available to him after he gets his college degree and becomes successful. When Jimmy and Carrie graduate, they would attend a graduation party where Jimmy would be an escort for Carrie. As a graduation gift, Carrie gives Jimmy a scrapbook to commemorate their school years together. After high school, Jimmy wanted to attend James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. However, his father Denny suggests, though, that Jimmy attend Allegheny College in Cumberland, Maryland. Jimmy's parents felt that Jimmy wasn't mature enough for a large school, thinking he may just party there instead of focusing on his schoolwork. So attending Allegheny College that fall, he studies respiratory therapy. Carrie would attend college elsewhere in WVU to study psychology, but the two would stay in close touch with each other. Jimmy's respiratory therapy class was only 4 students, so the 4 of them would hang out together, study together, and Jimmy would bring them to his parents' house for the pool and food. Jimmy would get in an apartment in Cumberland with his college friend, Reggie Alice. Jimmy's mother liked Reggie. Reggie would often mess with Jimmy about being overweight and his obsession with and likes with thinner girls that were cheerleaders, or of that of the cheerleader type. So in May of 1992, Jimmy is 20 years old and has an associate's degree in respiratory therapy. Jimmy would apply to WVU for chemistry majors, and both Reggie and Jimmy applied to WVU Hospital as interns. Carrie Whitaker was already at WVU and suggested that the two get an apartment with her boyfriend Seth. On the first day of orientation, Jimmy would meet a respiratory therapist, Stephanie. Stephanie was 5 years older than Jimmy, but the two would have an attraction to each other. The two become close and begin dating, and not long after dating, Jimmy brings Stephanie to meet his parents when the two became engaged, and one of the first people that Jimmy would tell would be his friend Carrie. When the two become engaged, Jimmy and Stephanie would get in an apartment together, and Stephanie would become pregnant, and then Denny Michael would secretly marry Jimmy and Stephanie without telling Stephanie's parents. Close friends of Jimmy and Stephanie knew of the wedding, but they weren't invited as it was a private wedding. Not long after the two had their secret wedding, they would have a second church wedding organized by Stephanie's parents, with Ruth, Jimmy's mother, saying that it was a disaster. With Stephanie being pregnant, she was having issues getting her dress on. When Stephanie's parents learned of the first wedding, they always had that resentment towards Jimmy and his parents. Jimmy and Stephanie would have 2 kids together. Jimmy and Stephanie were renting a house owned by Stephanie and her father. So Jimmy would take on extra shifts at Ruby, trying to save for both a mortgage and medical school after receiving his bachelor's in chemistry. When Jimmy was getting ready to sign up for medical school, Stephanie drops a bombshell on Jimmy that she had racked up thousands of dollars of credit card debt. So instead of paying for medical school, Jimmy would pay the credit card debt, as well as buying a house for him and his family. Over the fall and winter months of '96, Stephanie would file several police reports against Jimmy. She would argue and complain that she had been pinched by Jimmy in one argument, and then Jimmy threw a shoe through a window in another argument, and then tried to reconcile with her by buying her favorite perfume. 5 months after Jimmy's daughter was born, the two separated. Jimmy bought another house so that the kids could stay with him. Jimmy's father would counsel Jimmy to tell him to work it out with Stephanie. Being a religious man, he always thought that you always worked it out, you didn't just get divorced. So in June of '98, they would reconcile, one of many, and then they would also renew their wedding vows. Even after all the reconciling and renewing of their wedding vows, they would still have a rocky marriage. So Jimmy begins working night shifts so that there can always be a parent with the kids when the other one was working. So when working night shift, that's when Jimmy would meet Shelly Angus. Michelle, or Shelly, was born January 21st, 1972, in Clarksburg, West Virginia. Michelle grew up in a middle-class Catholic family. Her parents ran a tight ship on Michelle and her brother growing up. Michelle would later on complain about not getting enough attention as a child or even enough hugs or praise whenever they would accomplish something. She would also complain about not having enough time with her father. Her mother would make a statement that they were strict on her kids and that maybe they were even a little too strict on them. Shelly was always an overachiever, outgoing, and a peppy kind of girl. She would join the cheerleading team or squad whenever she was 13, but in order to join, she had to be able to do a backflip, which Michelle would practice for weeks until she was able to consistently do it without falling or landing on her head or her neck. Then at one game, she would receive a good amount of attention, which would continue, and that would be the start of an unraveling. Around 1982, Michelle had a newspaper clipping of her and another student in junior high at a competition holding a giant pom-pom. This would be a very sentimental prized possession of Michelle's as one of her greatest accomplishments in her cheerleading career. Not long after that, she would be arrested for shoplifting from an AME's with her friends. Knowing that it was wrong, but she did it anyway, she stole a bag from the store. When Shelly turned 16, she would receive a black Ford Escort GT from her parents. She would drive her friends to McDonald's or around the high school parking lot. Michelle went to a small Catholic school in Clarksburg, West Virginia. She received good grades and graduated with a 3.9 GPA. Shelly would receive some cultural shock going to WVU University as she graduated in a class of 20 and now she's in a class of 200. Michelle roomed with her childhood-long best friend, Renee, and Michelle would have her sights on the cheerleading team at WVU. Michelle's major was pre-pharmacy, and Renee's major was in business. Michelle struggled with pre-pharm as she couldn't handle the chemistry and would end up dropping pre-pharm and moving to nursing. Michelle would go home to Clarksburg during holidays where she would see her boyfriend of 3 years and also friends and family. Michelle and her boyfriend ended up breaking up after she told him that she was going to try out for the WVU cheerleader team because he thought that college cheerleaders were just sluts. So Michelle began seeing another guy, and her best friend Renee doesn't even know about it until Michelle becomes pregnant. So the guy that Michelle was dating was Bruce Atkins, who was in the Air Force Reserves. The relationship would end because Bruce didn't want to get married or have a kid. And Michelle was petrified to tell her parents because her father, being an old school Italian Catholic person, stated that girls like her didn't get pregnant before marriage. So the college boyfriend bounces because he wants no part of that life, and Michelle decides to have the kid and continues on with college and also gets on the cheerleading team. And Michelle's mother would drive up from Clarksburg to babysit her kid while Michelle attended class and cheerleading. So not long after that, Michelle meets another guy, Rob Angus, who Shelley would make known that Rob wasn't her type. However, she did like the fact that he was good with her son, and most importantly, Rob treated Michelle like a queen. Being an attention-starved girl that she was, she definitely embraced this. Rob and Shelley would get engaged, and not long after, she gets pregnant again, but Rob talks her into having an abortion. After that, their relationship would start to get shaky, but the wedding invites were already out, and instead of getting embarrassed by calling off the wedding, they get married in July of 95. After the wedding, the relationship would begin to spiral and get worse. But to keep up the facade of a perfect and happy marriage, she would keep that to herself and not even tell her best friend Renee. In early of 96, Shelley gets arrested again for shoplifting and claims that it was a mistake. After that incident, she becomes pregnant again, and despite the rocky marriage with Rob, this time she would have the kid. I want to thank the show's sponsor, BetterHelp, for helping keep the flame lit of the campfire for this episode. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service that's 100% online. So you don't have that awkwardness of sitting in a waiting room with a whole bunch of other strangers waiting to see your therapist. With BetterHelp, you have access to a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with whatever you're dealing with. All you have to do to get started is answer some questions about what your needs and preferences are in therapy. So that way, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist that is right for you. And if you want to change your therapist because maybe you're not comfortable with them, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional charge. You also don't have to wait any specific time or any number of sessions to change your therapist. So when you match up with that right therapist, you can talk to your therapist however is most comfortable for you, whether it's text, chat, phone, or video. You can also message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you and your schedule. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you, with more scheduling flexibility and more affordable prices. So if you go to the website and use the show's code, betterhelp.com/CCC, not only does that let them know that you heard it at the campfire, but you'll also receive 10% off your first month. So that's betterhelp.com/CCC. BetterHelp, HELP.com/CCC. So now we're caught up to where Shelley meets Jimmy on night shift while the two are working at Ruby Memorial Hospital in 1999. At the time, Shelley was still married to Rob and Jimmy was still married to Stephanie. Jimmy was a respiratory therapist at Ruby, and the two became friends quickly. The two would bond pretty quickly as they were both having marriage problems, and they also had 2 kids from their marriages. Shelley was attracted to Jimmy's ambition and his goals, while Jimmy was attracted to Shelley because she was pretty and had that cheerleading background that Jimmy was always attracted to. Eventually, Michelle and Jimmy wanted to take their relationship more seriously and to the next level, so they both would file for divorce and become serious in 1999. The two would get married in May of 2000, 3 months after Jimmy's divorce was finalized. Michelle and Jimmy would buy a house together about 5 minutes from Ruby, and it was also close to WVU, where Michelle would go back for her master's degree to become a nurse practitioner. Jimmy ultimately decided to not go back to med school because he didn't want to miss out on his children's lives. So he would instead coach football, of which both sons played, and Michelle was the cheerleading coach, of which both daughters were a part of. Jimmy also started a home health company called Mountaineer Home Medical, delivering home oxygen to patients in the area. Although it wasn't the doctor dream that he dreamed of, the money that he was making from the company was good, especially for the area in West Virginia. Even Morgantown is considerably cheaper than some other parts of the country and other cities. Michelle, being the attention-seeking person that she was and keeping her appearance up, Jimmy had issues with his weight as he always had during his life and was a bigger guy. He would attempt to work on his weight problem and would seldomly work out, but constant pressure from Michelle would be a negative approach and always comparing Jimmy to other guys who weren't as big as him or were better on the eyes. Some people have problems with controlling their weight because of genetics. Genetics can play a role in overweight issues. People who have never had that problem or always had a fast metabolism always think differently, but science has proven that genetics can play a role in some circumstances. But there's other reasons for weight gains and problems that could be from certain health conditions as well that can also play a role. Also, some people just love food a bit more than others, and that is the reason why they have a weight gain and weight problems. I don't know the why or the what of Jimmy's cause for his weight issues, and nor am I going to speculate because I didn't know him or know his history. Jimmy's weight wasn't the only issue for Michelle either that she had with Jimmy. She wanted to drop down to part-time work because she said that she wanted to spend more time with the kids and started looking into her own small business venture with a partner who was a friend and employee of Jimmy's, Bobby Teets. Bobby drove the delivery truck for the home health business, and Michelle's idea was to open an embroidery business making hats, t-shirts, and probably uniforms for the local youth and their sports teams and the cheerleaders in the area. They would receive the financial funding through Jimmy's home health business, which Jimmy would then come on board in November of 2005. By mid-November, the only thing needed for the embroidery business was the machine, which was going to be the most expensive financial purchase. On November 17, 2005, Michelle and Bobby head off to Chicago for an embroidery conference where she places an order for a machine. Everything was going great for Michelle, except for her home life, because it wasn't the home life that she wanted. So while out in Chicago, Bobby and Michelle share a hotel room and end up having an affair while they are there. This we'll get into more detail in a little bit later in the case. The morning of November 29, 2005, Michelle is up between 5 and 15 as per her usual for getting ready for the day and work. All the kids are out of the house at their prospective exes, and Jimmy is still in bed as he doesn't have to leave for work until about 7 a.m. Okay, so now if you remember at the intro when Michelle was seen at her house at about 8:15, 8:20, somewhere in there, and she is up at 5 a.m. to go to work around 6 or 7. All the sources that I read never really had a specific start time for Michelle that day. This will play a factor later on in the case. So Michelle gets about 5 hours into her shift before receiving the call about her house being on fire. The fire was reported at about 10:30 according to reports by a volunteer firefighter who saw the smoke coming out of the eaves of the roof. Michelle would be calling Jimmy but not receiving any answers. So before long, while firefighters were controlling the blaze, friends and families started gathering outside of the residence, beginning to think that Jimmy didn't get out of the house. Bobby Teets arrives on scene after hearing the news of the fire because Jimmy never showed up for work. Bobby tells the police and the detectives that Jimmy never showed up for work and to check the garage to see if his car was there. If his car was still in the garage, he told police, then he was probably still in the house. So after finding the car in the garage, they tell the firefighters to look for a body of a victim inside, and once the firefighters make entry into the bedroom, they find the remains of a burnt corpse still in bed. The body was unidentifiable, still laying in bed. It was presumed to be Jimmy. The bed and the body were so burned and charred, it was almost not noticeable. When firefighters notified police of finding the body, they told Michelle that Jimmy didn't make it. They presumed that it was Jimmy, but they would have to confirm with dental records. Now, after receiving this news, her only reaction was only to ask them, "Are you sure?" with no expression. Wasn't even upset. Now, everyone handles bad news and death differently. It is also completely possible that the news hadn't sunk in for her yet, so still in disbelief, and when receiving news like that for the first time, it can take a moment to process. The body was so charged and burnt that the only way to confirm the ID was from the dental records. Friends at the scene with Michelle would observe Michelle being hysterical. A friend of Michelle's called Michelle's mother to tell her what happened because Michelle was unable to speak at that time. So this is probably when the news of her husband dying in the fire probably sank in. So with the car being in the garage and Michelle still calling Jimmy with no answer while she was outside the house, the identification was pretty obvious to everyone, although confirmation would still have to be made. After the fire is completely out, police and the fire marshal begin gathering evidence for their investigation. As par with any fire with any death, it is treated like a homicide and investigated like a homicide until proven otherwise. One thing they noticed is why Jimmy didn't try getting out of bed when the fire started. Between the smoke and the detectors going off, the smoke and the heat of the fire didn't wake Jimmy up to even try to escape the fire. Usually when a victim is trying to escape a fire, they are usually found by a doorway or a window, and they're usually right within about a foot of that window, if not closer. While investigators are in the bedroom, a clothes iron is found near the foot of the bed. The fire marshal also found it odd that it wasn't a whole lot of fire damage or even a lot of smoke and water damage in the other areas of the house, that it was just confined primarily to the master bedroom where Jimmy's body was found. According to the fire marshal's report, the fire either started on the bed or immediately in the area around the bed. Also, the ceiling right above the bed was completely burned through. The room was gutted by the fire because the bedroom door, which was pretty flimsy, was closed and contained the fire to the bedroom. And also, the bed was completely gone except for the springs and the body that remained. The fire ended up burning hot enough on the bed that it ended up burning a hole through the floor, and you could see from the living room below all the way to the roof. So the iron found at the foot of the bed was plugged into the adjacent wall, and investigators thought maybe that could have been the source of the fire. However, the hottest temperature that the base plate of the iron gets is about 400 degrees. Not quite hot enough to start a fire, although it would probably burn a hole through your clothes. So the iron wasn't the only mystery. They were still trying to answer the question of why didn't Jimmy Michael try to save himself? Surely he would have woken up to the smoke detectors, the fire and the smoke, especially with him starting to catch on fire, because then you're burning and you have all that pain shooting through your body. So if a fire starts somewhere else and someone is sleeping, then smoke travels to that room and it can cause the person to go into an even deeper sleep and die of CO poisoning. However, if the fire would to start in the same room as the person sleeping, such as on the bed that you are sleeping on, then the person would wake up and roll out of bed to try to escape the fire because they're burning. No one's just going to lay there and let themselves burn to death. So there were some things not adding up right by the time of the preliminary report when it came out and was finalized. For the time being, the fire was ruled as undetermined until they could look further into it. Michelle began acting strangely on scene, and her demeanor had changed while she was walking around the scene. Witnesses would say that she wasn't acting like a typical wife that had just lost her husband. So if we look into her background as an ICU nurse and all her years of training and experience to stay calm during high-stress situations, That could have something to do with it, but some people also wondered if there was more to it. When Jimmy's parents arrived that afternoon, Jimmy's father gives Michelle a hug, thanking her for loving Jimmy, and Michelle replied to him saying, "I wish I could have loved him more," which struck odd for Denny. At around 5 p.m., dental records were confirmed that it was Jimmy. The following day, the autopsy report found that Jimmy had no smoke inhalations in his lungs, which is a little bit weird if you die in a fire, right? So now here's the twist. The autopsy report showed that Jimmy died prior to the fire being started. So the fire marshal and police decided that normal testing wouldn't be enough, so they wanted a deep tissue toxicology done of the skin and the internal organs, which there was enough of Jimmy's body to get samples of for the test. So while investigators are waiting for the results, they begin looking into the alibis of the people who had access to the home on the day of the fire, which Michelle having the greatest access. Investigators reviewed the surveillance footage at Ruby, and it has Michelle leaving the hospital at 8:11 a.m., returning 17 minutes later. Investigators talked with neighbors and other people in the neighborhood, where one neighbor mentioned that he had seen Michelle around 8:20 or 8:30 leaving her house, which corresponds with the surveillance tapes of Michelle's car returning to the Ruby's parking lot. So there was definitely opportunity. However, the only problem with Michelle setting the fire was that there's a 2-hour window from the time that Michelle is seen at the house and the first sighting of the fire when it was called in. Investigators decided to call in an arson specialist, of which they would set up 6 full-scale mock-ups of the bedroom. On December 3rd of 2005, following the fire, Michelle laid her husband to rest. If she had been still distraught and upset over her husband's death, she didn't show any at his funeral. People at the funeral noted that she didn't cry at the funeral or show any emotion. Her mother would say that it was that she was holding back the grief for her children so that they wouldn't be upset. Investigators, though, weren't persuaded. Also, during the first week of December, investigators were interviewing close friends and family to find out what kind of relationship and marriage that Jimmy and Michelle had to try and see if there was any motive for Michelle to want to start the fire. So that's when they interview Bobby Teets, and that's when he tells them that their trip to Chicago would turn into more than 2 friends and colleagues going on business, and that they would end up having an affair while they were there. Bobby claimed that it was a one-time thing and it was over, but it was still a means of motive. If Jimmy had found out about it, it could have led to divorce. Then Michelle would lose everything: the house, her business venture, and the money backing it, as well as Jimmy's income from his business. But if Jimmy died, then Michelle would get everything and have everything to gain, plus $700,000 in insurance payout between the $500,000 life insurance policy as well as the $200,000 homeowner's insurance if something happened to the house. Sounds like to me investigators have suspect number 1. So investigators bring Michelle in for a recorded interview. When Michelle first goes in for the interview, she doesn't have a lawyer present because she doesn't think she needed one. At the time, Michelle didn't realize she was a suspect and would even have her own list of questions for investigators.
So with that toxicology stuff, are you looking to see if someone poisoned them or something?
We're just looking to see what's in his system.
So then after about an hour, the tone of the interview would change, where investigators would ask her if she left the hospital the day of the fire. Shelley would deny ever leaving the hospital that morning. However, investigators have video and also eyewitness statements of Shelley leaving the hospital and returning home. After being presented with the video, Shelley denies leaving the hospital and that it was raining, and she moved her car to the parking garage. So instead of pushing further on the fact that she left the hospital, they shift gears and investigators ask her about the affair with Bobby Teets.
Describe your relationship with Bobby.
Just friends. Good friends.
Why do you think Bobby would say that? He's had sex with you.
I have no idea.
So when Michelle denies having the affair with Bobby Teets, they show her the video of her kissing Bobby in the lobby of the hotel in Chicago. And that is when she changes her story from going from just being friends to it was a brief affair. So now that investigators have Michelle confessing to the affair, they begin to apply pressure about the morning of the fire and that she was seen at the house 2 hours before the fire started. And she would claim that she lied about being at the house that morning because she was living with the guilt of not checking on her husband or the house to make sure everything was okay before going back to work. She would explain to investigators that she went back to the house because she forgot a piece of paper that she had to mail out for the embroidery business, but when she got to the house, she found it sitting in the seat next to her, and that she just left and went back to the hospital without checking on the house or her husband. So then Michelle would tell investigators that she thought maybe the iron had fallen over and started the fire from a malfunction. However, if there had been a fault in the cord of the iron, where both of the conductors would come in contact with each other, it would have melted the insulation of the cord, and the cord was fine and fully intact. So investigators were trying to figure out how a fire could smolder for 2 hours before breaking out to fully engulfing a room, or totally burning up the entire room and almost everything inside. They would reach out to the ATF field office in West Virginia, where they spent 2 days documenting everything and taking everything from the room. Then, in a lab in Maryland, they would end up reconstructing 6 full-scale mock-ups of the bedroom to try to recreate the exact same results of the fire. The mock-ups had the same flooring, carpet, wall composition, paint, as well as the same location of the ventilation systems to pinpoint the exact conditions that they were on November 29th, 2005. While the results from the mock-up were going to take several months to come in after being analyzed, investigators were playing the waiting game for those results, but the toxicology reports came in and it found that Jimmy's body had a lethal dose of rocuronium in his system. Rocuronium is a paralytic drug that is used on patients when preparing them for surgery. Rocuronium is such an effective, strong drug that it can also make someone stop breathing, leading to obvious death. That's why prior to administering the drug, patients need to be on a breathing apparatus before it can be given. At the time, it was considered a floor drug, which means that it was as accessible as Tylenol was in the medicine cabinet. If administered and not hooked up to oxygen and supplemental breathing apparatus to assist with breathing while under the drug can become lethal and death can occur as fast as 7 to 8 minutes. According to reports, it was about 13 minutes for Jimmy to die, and as a nurse, Michelle would have known this. According to reports, while the drug is taking effect on the body, it doesn't stop the process of the mind, meaning you will still be able to think and understand what's going on, but won't be able to do anything about it. With Jimmy's medical training and worked as a respiratory therapist, he probably knew what was happening, but wouldn't have been able to do anything about it except wait to die, which must have been a very unnerving feeling. Add that to one of the worst ways to die. Michelle was knowledgeable about rocuronium as Jimmy would have been, being a nurse and a nurse practitioner. And while working with the pediatric unit, it was easily accessible, so it wouldn't have been hard for Michelle to be able to get the drug and administer it to Jimmy while he was sleeping. I want to thank the show's sponsor, BetterHelp, for helping keep the flame lit of the campfire for this episode. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service that's 100% online. So you don't have that awkwardness of sitting in a waiting room with a whole bunch of other strangers waiting to see your therapist. With BetterHelp, you have access to a network of over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with whatever you're dealing with. All you have to do to get started is answer some questions about what your needs and preferences are in therapy. So that way, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist that is right for you. And if you want to change your therapist because maybe you're not comfortable with them, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional charge. You also don't have to wait any specific time or any number of sessions to change your therapist. So when you match up with that right therapist, you can talk to your therapist however is most comfortable for you, whether it's text, chat, phone, or video. You can also message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you and your schedule. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you, with more scheduling flexibility and more affordable prices. So if you go to the website and use the show's code, betterhelp.com/CCC, not only does that let them know that you heard it at the Campfire, but you'll also receive 10% off your first month. So that's betterhelp.com/CCC. BetterHelp, HELP.com/CCC. With the results of this report of the drug being in his system, plus all the lies of Michelle about the affair and leaving the hospital on the day of Jimmy's death, and the fire, it was the nail in the coffin that investigators needed to make an arrest and charge Michelle with murder and arson. So there's two different dates depending on which report you read. March 10th and March 14th of 2006. Morgantown police arrest and charge Michelle with murder and arson while she's at the hotel that her and her children were staying at while waiting the insurance payout to repair her home, which she's not going to need to really worry about anymore. Michelle's trial would take place in Charleston, West Virginia on July 9th of 2007. It took place in Charleston because of the publicity that the case had gained in Morgantown. At the time of the trial, Michelle was 35 years old and facing a first-degree murder charge as well as first-degree arson charge and facing life sentences in prison without the eligibility of parole. It was reported that when Michelle walked into the courtroom for her trial, she acted confident, all smiles, and gave her dad a thumbs up like she was going to beat the charges, despite the evidence against her. Going into the trial, there was still one unanswered question. How could the fire smolder for 2 hours before flames and smoke became visible for other people to see it? The answer is simpler than it may seem. Think about it for a minute, and we'll get back to that in a couple of minutes. With only having mostly circumstantial evidence, and the only thing linking Michelle to the crime was the rocuronium found in Jimmy's system when he died, and the only availability of the drug was in a hospital setting, the prosecution opened their arguments with the timeline of Michelle injecting her husband with the drug. The prosecution would say that Michelle injected rocuronium into Jimmy's body before leaving for work and then came home around 8:20 to start the fire before returning to work. While the defense argued in the opening statements and made claims that there was a 2-hour period between the time that Michelle returned home and when the fire was first reported. When Michelle took the stand, she denied killing her husband and setting the fire. She explained the reason that she lied to investigators because she left work without permission and was afraid of getting in trouble or caught. But if that was the case, then why didn't she just say that initially when she was first interviewed by investigators? Ken Tennant, who was the fire marshal who investigated the fire, was called to the stand by the prosecution to give a crash course in fire science and also to explain the series of events of how the fire would have started and easily could have been to have started the fire with a match or any open flame. Michelle's original plan for the fire was the iron and leaving it turned on the bed thinking it would start the fire and that she could have established her alibi at work when receiving a call that her house was on fire while at work. However, whenever 8 a.m. came around and never received a call, she begins to panic, and that would be when she returns home to set the fire. But when she returns home to set the fire, she closes the bedroom door, not realizing that fire needs oxygen to burn and grow. So when she lit the fire on the bed consumed all of the oxygen in the room, and then the headboard collapsed into pieces and smoldering coals landed on the floor behind the bed, working its way through the floor and then into the living room ceiling below the bedroom. And then once the hole was made, the fire got oxygen again and it accelerated and permitted it to grow into a flashover, which would have caused the room to become fully engulfed. And then that is when it was seen and first reported at 10:30 a.m. This would all be explained by Ken Tennant, whose explanation was backed up by the video from the ATF experiment of the room mock-ups. The defense, however, would cast doubt on the prosecution's claims that Michelle started the fire. They argued that Michelle was only absent from the hospital for 17 minutes. This was including drive time. So they claimed that with driving to and from the hospital, based on witness statements as well as video cameras, that when she returned home that she would only have had 60 seconds or less in the house to start the fire. Attempting to put holes in the prosecution's case, Michelle would take the stand in her own defense and offer up explanations of lying to investigators about the affair. She would claim that she was ashamed of the affair and cheating on her husband, Jimmy, that everyone was already hurting and dealing with enough with the loss of Jimmy. On July 18th, the case was handed over to the jury to deliberate Michelle's fate. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury would find Michelle guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree arson. However, they would also state to have mercy applied to her sentencing, which in West Virginia at the time of the trial, mercy was life in prison with the possibility of parole within 15 years. It was clear that the jury had mixed feelings of the verdict for Michelle, because why would you convict someone of murder and arson but grant them mercy in sentencing? A question that a lot of people ask. The reasoning behind the mercy, at least for one juror, was that when they were asked to speak and comment of the reflection of the trial and being a juror, they would go on to say that they felt like locking her up for life and throwing away the key was way too easy. They wanted her to constantly have that thought and wondering if she would ever be released and be able to taste and see her freedom ever again, or if she would remain locked up, slowly losing that glimmer of hope of ever getting out. In order for her to be released on parole, she would actually have to adhere to the policies, rules, which she seemed to often always ignore while working at the hospital. Michelle's defense lawyer, Tom Dyer, stated after the trial he was going to review for grounds for an appeal and asked the judge to vacate the verdicts and order a new trial before sentencing began, and if necessary, he would appeal the decision of Stones to the state Supreme Court. According to one source from Times, West Virginia, that Michelle's ex-husband, Rob Angus, made an anonymous phone call to the police tipping them off that James Michael was drugged, and that Tom Dyer was not made aware of this information until the day of the trial. At the sentencing hearing that took place on September 19, 2007, Michelle would speak again to the court, addressing Jimmy's parents, expressing her innocence. So the judge took the jury's recommendation in giving Michelle mercy for the murder conviction. However, for the arson conviction, he sentenced Michelle to the maximum allowance of 20 years to run consecutively, which means that she would be eligible for parole after 20 years. So by my calculations, her first eligible date for parole release would be September 19th, 2027. And that's if she gets out of prison. So what happened to the children? Well, Jimmy's ex and Michelle's ex-husband have custody of the children, and the house has since been torn down. That concludes this case at the Campfire. I know there's a lot more information that I didn't include in this story, as there is a lot of information to cover. All resources used to gather information for the case include, but not limited to, news articles, reports, documentaries, as well as other sources. Also, Some of the audio that was used was from the Dateline documentary, which I found a copy of on YouTube. So if you want to check it out, you'll be able to find it over there. Also, if you'd like to listen to ad-free shows as well as bonus episodes, and also to get a shout out on the podcast during the most recent episodes, then sign up and join me over at the Bonfire. You can find the Bonfire over on Patreon, where there are different tiers that you can choose from. As the podcast grows, more tiers will be added. Make sure that you tell everyone that you know, including the strangers at the coffee shop when you're getting your morning coffee, to check out and listen to the podcast and rate it a 5-star. Word of mouth and giving us those ratings on Apple help the podcast tremendously. So the bigger that the podcast can grow, the less ads that I'll have to do for you guys. Also, if you wish to support the show and not necessarily sign up for a subscription, you can support the show with the S'mores Fund through the website campfirecrimechronicles.com. A link will be provided into the show notes. Or if you want to directly go to PayPal and support us there, it's campfirecrimechronicles@gmail.com. Also, don't forget to check out the merch store that you can find also on the website campfirecrimechronicles.com. So join me next time in 2 weeks as we gather around the campfire for the next case that we dive into. And remember to sleep with one eye open. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast.